The oil terminal was quiet. That was the first mistake anyone made, assuming quiet meant safe. Somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, cutting through Black Sea swells at 35 knots, 8 Sea-Baby unmanned surface vessels were already committed. No turning back, no abort code that would matter now. The GUR maritime strike cell had spent weeks threading through satellite imagery, tidal charts, and coastal patrol rotation data to find the one window where Novorossiysk's defenses had a gap. And in that gap, 8 waterborne missiles disguised as speedboats were racing toward the Sheskharis oil terminal, the single most important revenue node in Russia's wartime economy. This is the story of what happened when Ukraine stopped hunting warships and started hunting the money that pays for them. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And this operation, this strike against infrastructure that Moscow thought was untouchable, rewrote what maritime asymmetric warfare can accomplish, not just tactically, strategically, financially, existentially, because Sheskharis isn't just a terminal, it's the aorta of Russia's war machine. Understand this number. The Novorossiysk oil export complex processes approximately 40 million metric tons of Urals crude annually. Every barrel that leaves through those loading arms is foreign exchange flowing directly into the Kremlin's wartime budget. Western sanctions cut off Russian access to European markets. Alternative pipelines carry fractions of the volume. Sheskharis is what's left. The one irreplaceable choke point through which Russia converts underground oil reserves into artillery shells, drone components, soldier wages, and propaganda. Ukraine's intelligence community understood something Western analysts were still debating. The fastest path to ending this war wasn't grinding down Russian ground forces one battalion at a time. It was making the war economically unsustainable. And the most direct way to do that was to attack the economy itself. So the GUR drew up a plan. Months to refine, weeks to rehearse, less than 40 minutes to execute. The Sheskharis terminal sits at the northern edge of Novorossiysk harbor, roughly 4 kilometers from the city center, built against the rocky coastline in a configuration that Russian military planners spent decades believing made it impervious to conventional naval attack. And they weren't wrong about conventional naval attack. Ukraine doesn't have a surface navy. Ukraine doesn't have submarines. What Ukraine has is something the Russian Navy's defense architects never fully modeled, a weapons system that didn't exist in the threat libraries when those defensive positions were originally constructed. Sea-Baby. Ukrainian designed, GUR developed, domestically manufactured. Each unit is approximately 5 meters in length, displacing roughly 1,000 kilograms when fully loaded. Maximum speed approaching 75 to 80 kilometers per hour. Radar cross-section so small that coastal defense radar systems, calibrated to track vessels of conventional naval significance, pass right over it. The warhead section carries between 200 and 850 kilograms of explosive material depending on mission configuration. The propulsion system is electric hybrid, which reduces acoustic signature to near zero at approach speed. And the targeting suite, combining GPS waypoint navigation, optical terminal guidance, and in some variants, a live operator feed via satellite data link, gives each unit the ability to discriminate between specific structural targets at the final moment of approach. 8 of these weapons were now in the water, coordinated, sequenced, assigned to specific targets within the terminal complex. Which weapon system would ultimately prove most decisive in this operation? We'll answer that as the timeline unfolds. But consider your early read. Was it the Sea-Baby's explosive payload? Or was it what happened to insurance markets and tanker routing the moment the first image of burning infrastructure reached London and Rotterdam? Comment below. The GUR's Maritime Operations Directorate had been studying Novorossiysk's defensive posture for roughly 18 months before this operation reached approval stage. The intelligence picture was sobering. Russia had not been idle. Following earlier Ukrainian drone boat operations that damaged the landing ship Olanogorsky Gornyak in the harbor and damaged the SIG tanker off Novorossiysk's approaches, the Russian Black Sea Fleet and Federal Security Service had invested heavily in what they called coastal denial architecture. This included anti-drone nets stretched across the harbor entrance, capable of stopping surface vessels below a certain waterline profile. Additional patrol boats running overlapping sweeps on 2-hour rotational schedules. Shore-based radar upgrades at the Cape Dube headland position, armed CCTV coverage of the breakwater approaches, and an emergency response protocol that was supposed to get armed patrol craft to any point in the harbor within 6 minutes of a contact alert. 6 minutes. The Russian planners were proud of that number. It would prove irrelevant. Here's what the Russian defensive planners didn't fully account for. They designed their architecture to detect and stop threats approaching through the main harbor entrance. The GUR's operational analysts had been studying something different. The tidal charts for the northern coastline. specifically the section of rocky shallows between the main commercial breakwater and the industrial pier servicing the Sheskharis complex. In certain tidal conditions, specifically those that occur during a particular phase of the lunar cycle combined with specific wind patterns off the Caucasus Range, those shallows offered approximately a 180-meter corridor where water depth exceeded the minimum needed for Sea-Baby hull clearance but fell below the minimum depth where Russian coastal patrol boats could safely operate. A gap. Not in the nets. Not in the radar coverage. In the physics. The GUR had found it, measured it, modeled it, and built the entire operational timeline around a 6-hour window when tidal and lunar conditions aligned to make that corridor usable. The problem, and this is the obstacle that nearly killed the entire operation before it launched, was that the corridor only became viable in the hours immediately before dawn, launching 8 Sea-Baby units from a forward position, giving them enough time to navigate the Black Sea approach routes while avoiding the extended Russian patrol pattern that began at the harbor mouth, required a launch point that put the support vessel within range of Russian maritime patrol aircraft operating out of the Anapa airbase complex. 3 different launch profiles were war-gamed. The first 2 were rejected because they either compressed the transit time to a point where acoustic detection became a significant risk, or they placed the support vessel in a radar coverage zone for too long. The third profile, the one the GUR eventually approved, required a launch from a position northeast of the Kerch Strait shipping separation scheme, using a zigzag transit route that kept the drones in water depth zones where Russian hydroacoustic monitoring was historically less saturated. The support vessel would be exposed for approximately 4 hours during the approach phase. 4 hours in which a single Russian maritime patrol aircraft making a routine sweep could vector surface assets onto the launch position and end the operation before it began. The GUR accepted that risk, because the alternative was not accepting it. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this timeline destroys Russia's most critical export infrastructure and sends shockwaves through the global oil market. The Sea-Baby units launched in pairs, separated by 3-minute intervals to prevent electronic interference between navigation systems and to stagger their approach timing so that terminal guidance activation wouldn't create a detectable electromagnetic cluster on Russian coastal monitoring equipment. Each drone had been pre-programmed with a primary waypoint route and 2 alternate approach corridors, with the live operator team maintaining continuous data link from the support vessel's control center. The first pair crossed the outer harbor detection boundary at a point that placed them inside the shadow zone created by the industrial pier structure, a blind spot in the coastal radar coverage that the GUR had identified through signal analysis conducted over multiple months. Radar energy at the frequencies Russia's coastal systems used couldn't penetrate behind the pier structure at low angles. The Sea-Baby units, running at reduced speed to minimize wake signature, crossed that boundary without triggering any alert. The second pair followed 4 minutes behind, taking a slightly more northerly corridor that kept them in the shallow water zone along the rocky coastline. This pair was the insurance. If the first pair triggered a response and the terminal began emergency shutdown procedures, the second pair's targeting was preset to hit alternative priority targets, the pipeline manifold valves rather than the loading arms. The third pair was something different entirely. These 2 units were not assigned to terminal infrastructure. They were assigned to a specific vessel, a tanker that orbital satellite imagery had confirmed was positioned at loading berth 3, mid-transfer, hull riding low under the weight of Ural's crude she had already taken on. The GUR's targeting logic was simple and devastatingly effective. A tanker under load, hit while connected to loading arms, doesn't just create a fire. It creates an incident that forces every insurer in London to reassess whether their policies cover vessels operating in Novorossiysk. And when insurers reprice, tanker captains stop accepting bookings. And when tanker captains stop accepting bookings, oil stops moving regardless of whether the physical infrastructure is intact. The fourth pair, the final 2 units, carried modified warheads with delayed action charges specifically engineered for use against the storage manifold array on the terminal's eastern processing pad. This wasn't about creating immediate fire. This was about creating damage that would require specialized repair equipment that Russia's sanctioned economy would struggle to source, turning a one-night strike into a weeks-long shutdown. How many loading berths did Ukraine's strike ultimately put out of operation? A 2 B-3C, all 4 at Sheskharis. Hold that number. We'll return to the answer. At 3:47 a.m., the first contact report reached the Novorossiysk FSB Maritime Security Coordination Center. Not from radar. From a patrol boat crew who saw something they couldn't immediately classify. A low wake pattern in the northern shallows that didn't match any registered vessel. The crew reported it. Their supervisor logged it. The escalation protocol required confirmation from a second sensor before moving to active response. That confirmation delay would cost Russia everything. The Sea-Baby unit the patrol crew had spotted was the outermost drone of the second pair, and it was already past the point where interception was possible. Even if the response protocol had triggered instantly, the nearest armed intercept craft was 12 minutes away. The Sea Baby was 45 seconds from its terminal approach corridor. At 3:51 a.m., the first unit of the initial pair reached terminal approach distance and its optical guidance system activated, switching from GPS waypoint navigation to visual lock on the loading Berth 1 infrastructure. The operator, watching a live feed from the drone's camera at a distance that put him far outside Russian territorial waters, confirmed the lock, confirmed the target, and released terminal guidance authority to autonomous final approach. The drone covered the last 340 meters in 17 seconds. The loading arm assembly at Berth 1 is a fixed installation structure rated for continuous operation under high-pressure crude transfer, built to survive Black Sea weather, not explosives. The Sea Baby's warhead, configured for this strike with a semi-armor-piercing shaped charge optimized for steel infrastructure, detonated on the arm's primary connection point, the junction between the shoreside articulated section and the shipside manifold coupling. The detonation was followed, 8 seconds later, by the secondary detonation of pressurized crude still in the transfer line. The fireball was visible from the Novorossiysk city waterfront. At 3:52 a.m., 12 seconds after the first impact, the terminal's emergency shutdown system activated. Automated valve closures began. Pumping systems cut. The crew at the terminal's control building, a concrete structure 600 meters from Berth 1, initiated evacuation protocols. At 3:53 a.m., the second Sea Baby unit of the first pair struck Berth 2's loading structure. This detonation was smaller in the initial blast, but more consequential in its effects. The Berth 2 arm served the terminal's highest throughput transfer point, the one configured for very large crude carriers. Taking it offline removed the terminal's ability to service its highest value cargo operations even after any other damage was repaired. The patrol boat crew who had first spotted the suspicious wake pattern were now calling in a Priority 1 contact report. Multiple explosions. Terminal complex. Unknown number of vessels. The response machinery began grinding into motion. 6 minutes, the protocol said. The Sea Baby units didn't have 6 minutes to wait. At 3:54 a.m., the tanker at Berth 3, hull designation later identified through commercial shipping databases as operating under a non-disclosure flag arrangement used by sanctioned Russian export traders, took 2 impacts in rapid succession. The first struck her portside hull below the waterline aft of amidships. The second, following 2 seconds behind, hit the loading manifold connection on her port quarterdeck. The combined effect breached both the hull and the deck infrastructure simultaneously. A tanker hull carrying crude petroleum, breached below the waterline and above simultaneously, creates conditions that maritime emergency response systems classify as immediately uncontrollable. The vessel began taking on water from below, while burning from the crude igniting through the deck breach above. The crew, 31 personnel, according to subsequently analyzed Russian emergency communication transcripts, had approximately 4 minutes to abandon ship before the fire front reached the engine room. What they had not been told, what their shipping company had not been transparent about, was that their vessel was operating without valid P&I club insurance coverage because the insurer had quietly terminated the policy following a sanctions compliance review. There was no insurer to call. There was no maritime rescue coordination agreement in place. There was the Novorossiysk Harbor Emergency Service, which was currently dealing with 2 burning loading arm structures and had not yet reached the vessel. This is the moment where conventional military analysis would focus on the kinetic effects, the burning infrastructure, the hull breach, the structural damage to loading arms. But Conflict East exists to help you understand how modern warfare actually works. And what was happening at 3:54 a.m. in Novorossiysk Harbor was not primarily a kinetic event, it was a financial event. At that exact moment, in time zones already into business hours, commodity traders, shipping brokers, and reinsurance desk analysts were watching satellite imagery and early commercial intelligence feeds showing smoke rising from the Sheskharis complex. By the time the sun rose over London, the Lloyd's market had received preliminary loss assessments. By the time New York opened, the Ural's crude differential to Brent had already widened by $4 per barrel. By week's end, 9 separate tanker operators had quietly withdrawn from contracted Novorossiysk loading schedules. The strike hadn't just damaged infrastructure. It had repriced risk across the entire Black Sea crude export corridor. That was the design. That was always the design. At 3:56 a.m., the 4th pair of Sea Baby units reached the Eastern Processing Pad Manifold Array. These units carried the delayed action specialized warheads. The first detonated against the primary manifold isolation valve cluster, a system of interconnected valves, pressure sensors, and automated control actuators that manage crude flow between the storage tank farm and the loading berths. The damage wasn't spectacular in visual terms. No fireball. No secondary explosion. just precision destruction of the control components that made the entire manifold network function. Repairing that damage would require replacement valve actuators, specific pressure-rated coupling components, and control system integration parts that were, under the sanctions environment in place at the time of the strike, available from exactly 2 manufacturers globally. Neither of them was Russian. Neither of them was selling to Russia. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because this is where tactics meet economics, and the combination is more powerful than either alone. The second unit of the fourth pair struck the manifold array's secondary pressure relief system, a fail-safe structure that exists to prevent overpressure incidents in the storage tanks when the primary manifold is closed. Destroying the relief system didn't create an immediate explosion. It created a condition where the storage tanks could not safely be operated at full pressure until the relief system was restored, meaning the tanks would need to remain partially empty, meaning throughput capacity, even after other repairs, would be permanently constrained. The GUAR's targeting committee had spent weeks identifying which specific components, destroyed in which specific sequence, would create the longest cascading downtime. This was the result of that analysis. By 4:01 a.m., Russian emergency response vessels had reached the outer harbor perimeter. By 4:01 a.m., the Sea Baby units had completed their attack runs and their autonomous return protocols had been activated. By 4:01 a.m., Sheskharis terminal was burning in 3 separate locations. An uninsured tanker was actively sinking at berth 3. The manifold control array on the eastern pad was destroyed, and loading berths 1, 2, and 4 had sustained structural damage, rendering them non-operational. The response craft found nothing to intercept. 6 minutes. It had taken 7. The aftermath assessment that Ukrainian military intelligence compiled in the days following the strike drew on satellite imagery analysis, commercial vessel tracking data, intercepted Russian administrative communications, and open-source analysis of Russian government statements, which initially denied any significant damage and then progressively acknowledged greater disruption as the evidence mounted too high to suppress. The intercepted administrative communications were particularly revealing. In the 48 hours following the strike, Russian regional officials were sending encrypted messages to the Federal Emergency Management Ministry describing complete suspension of loading operations, structural assessment in progress on all 4 berths, and, most significantly, procurement inquiry for manifold control components, export restriction status unknown. That last phrase. Procurement inquiry, export restriction status unknown. A Russian official admitting, in administrative language, that they couldn't fix their own terminal because the parts were sanctioned. Ukrainian sources estimated total direct infrastructure damage at the Sheskharis complex in the range of 340 to 480 million US, accounting for the destroyed loading arm assemblies, the manifold control system, and the total loss of the tanker at berth 3. Insurance market analysis suggested the indirect costs: rerouting of crude shipments to lower throughput alternative terminals, increased shipping costs for all Black Sea crude exports, the repricing of maritime insurance across the entire corridor, multiplied the economic impact by a factor of 3 to 5 above the direct damage figure. The drone operators who executed this mission returned safely. Every member of the strike support crew returned safely. The Sea Baby units completed their return protocols. Ukrainian losses in this operation: 0. What do you think? Did the Kremlin ever fully disclose the scale of the damage to Sheskharis, or did they bury it? We read every comment on Conflict East. Tell us what you think actually came out of those administrative records. Satellite imagery conducted over multiple weeks following the strike confirmed that loading berth 3 remained non-operational for an extended period. Commercial vessel tracking data showed a significant reduction in tanker calls to Novorossiysk that persisted well beyond the period needed for basic structural repairs, consistent with the insurance withdrawal pattern Ukrainian targeting analysts had predicted. The manifold control array damage required the installation of temporary manual override systems that reduced throughput capacity and increased operational risk, conditions that any terminal operator worldwide would recognize as unacceptable for long-term high-volume operation. Russia faced a specific problem that Western sanctions analysts had not fully anticipated before this strike made it visible. Even when Russia had the political will to repair sanctioned infrastructure and the financial resources to pay for it, the supply chain for specialized petroleum terminal components ran through Western-aligned manufacturers who were not selling. Russia could build artillery shells with North Korean propellant. Russia could fly Iranian-designed drone variants. Russia could not, as it turned out, easily source the specific German and Italian manifold control actuators that their Black Sea terminal infrastructure depended on. If you believe tactics win wars, type Conflict East in the comments. Because this operation is the evidence that in 2025 and 2026, tactics and economics aren't separate domains. They're the same battlefield. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, which had spent the preceding months attempting to reconstitute some measure of operational presence after devastating losses to Ukrainian naval drone operations and missile strikes, had no meaningful capacity to respond to this attack. The fleet's surviving major surface combatants had been repositioned to Novorossiysk itself following the destruction of Sevastopol's utility as a major naval base, meaning they were present in the harbor when this strike occurred, meaning their crews watched the terminal burn from their moorings and were unable to do anything about it. There is a certain strategic symmetry in that image. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, once the dominant naval force in this body of water, once the symbol of Russian sea power from Sevastopol to the Bosphorus, reduced to spectators as Ukrainian naval drones burned the infrastructure that paid for the fleet's continued existence. What would NATO have done differently if they had developed the Sea Baby concept first? Would they have deployed it differently? Targeted differently? Integrated it with conventional naval forces rather than operating it as a purely asymmetric asset? Comment your analysis. The tactical question has genuine doctrinal implications. The lessons both militaries extracted from the Sheskharis operation will inform doctrine for years. For Ukrainian planners, the operation confirmed something the GUR's maritime warfare development community had been arguing since the earliest Sea Baby concepts were sketched out. In asymmetric naval warfare, the most valuable targets are not the adversary's weapons. They are the adversary's revenue. Destroy the weapons, and they build more. Destroy the revenue, and they cannot afford to build more. Ukraine does not need to sink every ship in the Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine needs to make the Black Sea too economically costly for Russia to use as an export corridor. The Sheskharis strike was one node in that larger campaign. For Russian planners, the operation exposed a catastrophic planning assumption. That infrastructure hardened against state-level naval attack was hardened against all naval attack. Sea Baby isn't a state-level naval weapon by any metric that Cold War threat libraries would recognize. It costs a fraction of a standard naval mine. It has no crew. It leaves no radar signature worth tracking with conventional coastal defense radar. It can navigate a tidal gap that patrol boats cannot follow it through. The entire Russian coastal defense architecture around Novorossiysk was optimized against threats that Ukraine no longer needed to field. Massive and expensive, calibrated against the wrong threat, unable to stop the actual attack. This is the lesson that will be studied in naval warfare colleges from Newport to Annapolis to Kyiv. Defensive architecture is only as valuable as the accuracy of its threat model. When the threat evolves faster than the defense, even the most expensive fortress becomes irrelevant. Now, the answer to the technical question from earlier. How many loading berths did Ukraine's strike put out of operation? The answer is C, all 4 at Sheskharis. Berths 1 and 2 sustained direct structural damage from Sea Baby impacts on loading arm assemblies. Berth 3 was rendered inoperable by the sinking tanker that blocked the berth and necessitated an extensive salvage operation before normal loading operations could resume. Berth 4, which escaped direct missile impact, was taken offline by the terminal's own emergency shutdown system, and the destruction of the manifold control array on the eastern pad meant that restoring flow to Berth 4 required restoration of the manifold system first, creating a dependency chain that kept all 4 berths non-operational simultaneously for a period extending well beyond what a simple structural repair timeline would have predicted. All 4. Every loading position at Russia's most important oil export terminal shut down simultaneously by 8 unmanned surface vehicles that cost a fraction of a percent of what they destroyed. This is conflict east. Real battles. Real tactics. Real consequences. Was the decision to target the manifold control system rather than the storage tanks themselves the right call? The GUR's targeting logic prioritized long-duration disruption over spectacular immediate destruction. But a direct hit on the storage tank farm would have created imagery that dominated global news cycles for days. Did Ukraine make the tactically correct choice by optimizing for economic impact over media impact? Could Russia have prevented this with different defensive investments? Probably not, given the physics of the tidal corridor and the radar cross-section of Sea Baby units. But a more aggressive forward patrol presence, operating further offshore and using active sonar rather than passive visual observation, might have extended the detection window enough to complicate the approach timing. Russia chose to invest in harbor entrance protection rather than open water early detection. That choice had consequences. What would you have done differently if you were commanding Ukraine's GUR Maritime Operations Directorate? The target list? The weapon configuration? The timing? Every choice in this operation had alternatives. The ones that were made achieved an outcome that Russian planners had categorized as impossible. What does that tell you about how threat modeling should work? Will the Kremlin succeed in restoring full Sheskharis capacity before international sanctions create permanent market shifts away from Russian crude? Comment why yes or no, because that answer determines not just the outcome of this operation, but the economic trajectory of the war itself. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Black Sea is quiet now, but the satellite images tell the story the Russian government refused to. Scorched metal where loading arms once stood, a salvage crane working where a tanker sank, and manifold structures wrapped in temporary bypass piping that represents the engineering equivalent of a bandage on a bullet wound. Silent evidence that a handful of unmanned watercraft, guided by Ukrainian intelligence analysts who spent months understanding the physics of a tidal gap, reached into the heart of Russia's wartime revenue and tore something out that cannot easily be replaced. Modern warfare punishes the assumption of safety. It punishes defensive architecture built for yesterday's threats. And it punishes the belief that distance and fortification can substitute for adaptability. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East.